You know how it is. You're reading through the Old Testament and you come across a law that just makes you scratch your head. One minute it's talking about something profound like loving your neighbor, and the next it's about not wearing a shirt made of two different fabrics. It can be super confusing, and it leaves a lot of us asking, which of these laws, if any, are we supposed to follow today? So let's just dive right into a classic example. There's a law in Leviticus that says you shouldn't wear clothing made of two different kinds of material. So does that make your favorite cotton poly blend t-shirt a sin? This is a great question because it gets right to the heart of this entire puzzle. And we're not just talking about one or two confusing rules here. The first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, contain over 600 individual laws. I mean, they cover everything from worship and justice to property and family life. So the question isn't really if they matter, it's how they matter for us right here, right now. Okay, so to try and make sense of all this, a lot of people have turned to a really common 3-part framework for sorting these laws. And look, it's a helpful way to start thinking about it, but as we're about to see, it's got some pretty significant limitations. So this is what it looks like. You've got moral laws like do not murder, which seem to reflect God's timeless character. Then you have civil laws, which were basically the legal code for the nation of Israel. And finally, you have ceremonial laws, which were all about their worship, the temple, and sacrifices. On the surface, this looks great. It seems so neat and tidy, right? Well, here's the catch. The Bible itself never actually gives us these 3 neat little boxes. In fact, if you look closely, a lot of the laws seem to blend these categories together. Take the Sabbath law, for instance. You could argue it's moral, it's civil, and it's ceremonial all at the same time. So while this framework can be a good reading tool, it's definitely not the final answer. And this gets to a really crucial point. The law was given as a single, unified package. It was all part of what's called the Mosaic Covenant. Think of it like a specific, binding, legal agreement between God and the nation of Israel. And it was an all-or-nothing deal. You couldn't just pick and choose the parts you liked and ignore the others. So, this brings us to the most important question of all. If the law is this single package, what in the world did Jesus do with it? Did he just get rid of it? Did he tell us we have to follow all 600 plus laws perfectly? Well, his answer is a little different than you might expect. This right here, this might be one of the most significant things Jesus ever said about the Old Testament. And the whole key to understanding it is that last word, fulfill. He says he didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. So what does that actually mean? The original Greek word that gets translated as fulfill is plerasai, and it means so much more than just to obey the rules. It has this richer sense of bringing something to its intended goal, to its completion. Jesus is saying he came to be the grand finale, the final chapter that the entire Old Testament story had been pointing to all along. Think about it like this. To abolish would be like tearing down a building halfway through construction. But to fulfill is to finish the construction perfectly, to accomplish exactly what the blueprints were designed for. Jesus didn't come to tear down the story of the Old Testament. He came to be the climax of that story. See, through his life, death, and resurrection, Jesus brought in a new covenant, a new agreement. The Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians explains that the Old Testament law acted like a guardian for humanity. It showed us our sin and pointed out our desperate need for a Savior. But now that Christ has come, we're no longer under that guardian. The terms of our relationship with God have fundamentally changed. Okay, so if that old agreement, that old covenant has been fulfilled, what now? Where does that leave us? Well, this brings us to a really practical and, I think, much better way of understanding Old Testament law today. If we're not bound by the specific rules, how do we actually learn from them? This method is often called principlism, and really, it's a total game changer. Instead of asking, hey, does this rule still apply to me? We ask a much better question. What is the timeless principle that this ancient rule is trying to teach? It completely shifts our focus from the letter of the law to the heart and wisdom behind the law. And it's not some complicated academic exercise. It's actually a pretty straightforward process. First, you just try to figure out what the law meant to the original people who heard it. Second, you see how that specific rule connects to a bigger, broader command, like one of the 10 Commandments. And then finally, you pull out that timeless truth that we can apply to our own lives in our own context. All right, enough theory. Let's actually put this tool to work and see how it helps us understand a real law from the book of Deuteronomy. So in ancient Israel, houses had flat roofs, and people would hang out up there. It was like their patio. This law commanded them to build a little wall, a parapet, around the edge for safety. Now, on the surface, this seems totally irrelevant to most of us today. I mean, how many of us have flat roofs we use as living space? But let's apply our method. Okay, so step 1, the specific law is build a railing. Easy enough. Step 2, what broader command does this connect to? You shall not murder. Why? Because building the railing is about preventing an unnecessary accidental death. Step 3, what's the timeless principle? It's that we have a responsibility to protect human life because every single person is valuable, made in the image of God. And step 4, how do we apply that principle today? Well, through things like modern building codes, workplace safety regulations, even rules about car seats for kids. The specific rule about a rooftop parapet may not apply, but the principle behind it is absolutely timeless. You see the huge mental shift here? We're moving away from cherry-picking which rules to follow, and we're starting to look for the timeless principles underneath them all. We stop seeing the law as just as binary choice between obeying or ignoring, and instead we start seeing it as an opportunity to understand and apply wisdom. It's no longer just a list of rules, it's a revelation of God's character, of His justice, His mercy, and His love. And this one question really changes everything about how we read the Old Testament. It's no longer some confusing ancient rule book that we have to either blindly obey or just ignore. Instead, it becomes this incredibly rich source of wisdom that, when we understand it correctly, shows us God's timeless design for how humans can truly flourish. It invites us not just to follow rules, but to think deeply and live wisely.